stars did not warn anyone. There was no great signal in the sky, no alarm from the deep space listening stations, no strange transmission that the scientists could decode in time. One moment, the colony world of Arden's Rest was a quiet planet. Green fields, blue rivers, children playing near the water, farmers bringing in the harvest. The next moment, the sky turned black with ships. Not a few ships, not a dozen, thousands. They came in total silence at first. The colony's defense grid tried to lock on. The sensors screamed with data. The garrison commander, a woman named Colonel Petra Solis, stood at her post and watched the screens and could not believe what she was seeing. The ships were enormous. Each one was bigger than any human vessel ever built. They blotted out the sun. Then the bombardment started. There was no warning, no demand to surrender, no communication of any kind. The first volley hit the capital city of New Lisbon and erased it in seconds. The second volley hit the farming districts to the south. The third hit the spaceport, the hospitals, the schools. There was no pattern that made military sense. They were not targeting weapons or soldiers. They were targeting people. Colonel Solis managed to get one transmission out before the command center was hit. She said 3 words. "They are killing everyone." Then the signal went dead. The species that had come to kill humanity called themselves the Veth. They were ancient, far older than humans. They had watched the galaxy for 1,000 years and had seen many civilizations rise. They had seen most of them fall too. Some fell on their own. Others were helped along. The Veth had a very simple rule for the galaxy. There was room for power, and there was room for submission. There was no room for equals. When humans first appeared on their long-range scans, spreading out from one small blue world into the stars at a speed that surprised even the Veth, a decision was made. The humans would be given no chance to grow. The Veth had watched other species grow and become problems. They would not make that mistake again. The strategy was simple, brutal, efficient. Strike the colonies first. Not the military ones, the civilian ones. The soft ones. The ones full of ordinary people with no weapons and no defenses. Kill enough of them fast enough, and the human leadership would panic. They would beg. They would offer anything. Their technology, their resources, their remaining worlds, in exchange for the killing to stop. Every species the Veth had done this to before had broken within weeks, most within days. It was not cruelty for its own sake. The Veth were not emotional beings. It was logic. It was mathematics. A civilization's will to fight was a resource like any other. Drain it fast enough, and there was nothing left to spend. So they hit Arden's Rest, then Callaway Station, then New Meridian, then the farming worlds of the Outer Belt, one after another, each one a hammer blow, designed not to destroy military strength, but to shatter human spirit. 40 million people died in the first 72 hours. The Veth fleet moved with cold precision, their admirals watching the numbers with the same feeling a surgeon feels when cutting. Detached, professional, confident in the outcome. They sent one message to the human government. One. It said, "Surrender all inhabited worlds. Disarm all military forces. Deliver your leaders for processing. Resistance will result in total elimination of your species." Then they waited. On Earth, in the deep bunker beneath the Ural Mountains where the emergency council had gathered, no one spoke for a long time after the message was read aloud. The room was full of the most powerful people in the human government. Generals, ministers, scientists, admirals, men and women who had spent their careers making hard decisions. Several of them were crying. They were not ashamed of it. 40 million people. Arden's Rest, Callaway Station, New Meridian. Names that had been ordinary words the day before and were now something else entirely. Something that would be said for the rest of human history, in a certain tone of voice. Secretary General Amara Osei sat at the head of the long table. She was 63 years old. She had gray hair cut short and dark eyes that missed nothing. She had been a doctor before she was a politician. She had held the hands of dying patients. She knew what loss looked like, and she knew what it did to people. She let the silence go on for exactly as long as it needed to. Then she spoke. "They expect us to surrender." No one answered. A general cleared his throat. "Secretary General, our current fleet strength is—" "I know what our fleet strength is, General Vasquez." Her voice was quiet. I know what the casualty numbers are. I know what the projections say. She looked around the room. I am asking you something different. I am asking, do any of you believe, in your hearts, that if we surrender, they will stop killing us? Another silence. Longer this time. Admiral Yuki Tanaka spoke first. She was the commander of the 1st Combined Fleet, a small woman with a reputation for thinking 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. She had said almost nothing since the emergency session began. No, she said simply. They will not stop. This is a species that hit civilian worlds first. They did not attack our military. They attacked our children. That tells us exactly what they are, and exactly what they intend. Agreed, said General Vasquez. There is no version of surrender that ends with humanity existing. They want us gone. Amara nodded slowly. Then we have our answer. She picked up the Veth message and looked at it one more time. And we have our purpose. She set it down. We do not surrender. We fight. We fight until there is no one left to fight, or until they are gone. She paused. Get me a communication channel. I want to send them a reply. One of the communications officers looked up from his station. What should the reply say, Secretary General? Amara thought for a moment. She thought about Arden's rest. She thought about 40 million people who woke up that morning and made breakfast and worried about small, ordinary things and never got to worry about anything again. Tell them no, she said. Just that. Tell them no. The Veth received the human reply and were confused by it. In their experience, a one-word refusal was not a negotiating position. It was either madness or it was the response of a species that did not understand the situation. Their senior strategist, a being called Executor Vrail, reviewed the message 3 times. Then he reviewed the casualty reports from the colonial attacks. Then he reviewed the human fleet positions, which showed no significant mobilization. Then he reviewed the message again. They said no, his aide reported, unnecessarily. I can read, Vrail said. He was quiet for a moment. Increase the pressure. Hit 2 more colony worlds. Let them count the bodies. They will change their answer. And if they do not? Vrail did not answer immediately. In 1,000 years of galactic history, every species they had approached this way had surrendered. Some had fought briefly first, a gesture, a show of pride, but none had simply refused. The mathematics were too clear. The power gap was too large. Rational beings, when faced with annihilation, chose to preserve what they could. They will change their answer, he said finally. They are not rational yet. They are in shock. Give them more shock. They will become rational. He believed this completely. He had never been more wrong about anything in his life. The 2 worlds Vrail chose next were Harrow's world and the station cluster around the gas giant called Jove's Eye. Harrow's world had a population of 11 million. It was a beautiful place, one of the oldest human colonies, settled more than 200 years before. It had universities and museums and theaters. It had old buildings made of local stone that had been standing for 5 generations. It had graveyards where the great-grandparents of the people who still lived there were buried. The Veth fleet arrived and did what it had done before. But something was different this time. When the Veth bombardment ships moved into position over Harrow's world, the planetary defense grid, old, outdated, never meant to fight anything like what was in orbit, opened fire anyway. It lasted 4 minutes. The defense platforms were destroyed one by one. They knew they had no chance. They fired anyway. And on the surface, something that the Veth had not planned for was happening. People were not running. They were recording. Every surviving comm device, every personal camera, every emergency broadcast system that still had power, was capturing what was happening and sending it outward into the quantum relay network that connected human space. Faces appeared on screens across 100 worlds, ordinary faces. A teacher standing in front of her students, holding a small child, looking directly at the camera. An old man on his front step, arms crossed, not moving. Young people who should have been running, standing still and watching the sky, and telling anyone who would listen what was being done to them, and by whom. They were not sending these images to the Veth. They were sending them to each other. And what those images did to the humans who received them was not what the Veth had calculated. It did not break their will. It forged it. The recruitment stations on Earth opened at 6 in the morning. By 6:15, The lines stretched around the block. By noon, they stretched for kilometers. Men and women of every age, who had never held a weapon in their lives, stood in the sun and the rain and waited for hours for the chance to sign their names and be told where to go and what to do. Veterans who had been retired for decades showed up and quietly asked to be reassigned. Factory workers asked what the factories needed to build and started building it without waiting to be asked twice. A physicist named Dr. James Okafor, who had spent 20 years studying theoretical propulsion and had published a paper 3 years earlier that nobody had read about a method of accelerating a mass driver round to near-light speeds using a particular arrangement of magnetic coils, walked into a military research facility in Lagos and put the paper on a desk and said, "I think I know how to make something that can hurt them. Can we try?" They let him try. In the orbital yards above Mars, the construction crews worked without stopping. Sleep was a luxury that rotated in shifts. The AI logistics networks that normally managed cargo schedules were repurposed to manage the impossible task of coordinating the largest military buildup in human history. Raw materials that had been destined for civilian projects were redirected. Mining ships that had been pulling ore for new colony construction pulled it instead for ship hulls and weapon systems and armor plating. Humanity had been surprised. Humanity had been hurt in a way that had no word for it yet. The languages had not caught up with what had happened. But humanity had not been broken. The Veth had made a mistake. They had chosen to hit the soft targets. The schools and the farms and the homes. They had believed that killing the innocent would kill the will of the survivors. They had never met humans before. They did not understand what killing the innocent did to the ones left alive. Admiral Tanaka stood at the observation window of the Mars Orbital Command Station and looked at the ships taking shape in the yards below. Her staff was behind her, working through the night, planning and calculating and arguing, and planning again. She had been awake for 31 hours and did not feel tired. She was not sure she would feel tired again for a long time. Her second in command, Commander Eli Marsh, came to stand beside her. "Numbers are in from the colonial fleets," he said quietly. "We have more ships reporting in than we expected. A lot of civilian ships have been converted. Cargo haulers, mining ships, colony transports. They're not warships, but they're big, and the crews know how to fly them." "Can they fight?" "Their captains say they can." Tanaka was quiet for a moment. "You know what the Veth don't understand," she said. "They hit our people. All kinds of people. Farmers and teachers and children. People who never thought about war once in their lives." She paused. "Now those people's families are here, and they are not afraid anymore. Fear requires uncertainty. These people know exactly what is at stake." She turned away from the window. "What is the earliest we can move?" Marsh checked his notes. "Fleet assembly can be complete in 18 days. Dr. Okafor's teams are saying the new weapons will be ready for field testing in 12, if the tests work." "They'll work," Tanaka said. She did not know this as a fact, but she said it as one. 18 days. Get me a full fleet review in 16. And tell the Secretary General we are on schedule." She went back to her desk. The star charts were spread across it. She looked at the positions of the Veth fleet and began to trace a path with her finger. The Veth had come to exterminate humanity. They had not considered the possibility that the extermination would not go as planned. They were about to. In the ruins of Arden's Rest, among the broken buildings and the silence where a city used to be, a young woman named Sarah Vance was still alive. She had been underground when the bombardment hit, in a drainage tunnel with 9 other people, and she had stayed underground for 4 days while the Veth ships completed their work above and then moved on. When she finally came up, she looked at what was left of New Lisbon, and she sat down in the ash, and she was very still for a long time. Then she stood up. She was 24 years old. She had been a student. She had been studying ecology, planning to spend her life helping colonies manage their environmental systems. She had never been in the military, and had never wanted to be. She looked at the ruins around her. She looked at the sky where the Veth ships had been. She found the other 8 survivors. They were scattered in the wreckage, each one sitting alone, each one staring at nothing. She went to each one in turn, and she said the same thing to all of them. "Get up. We're going to find a way off this rock, and then we are going to make sure this never happens to anyone else." They got up. All 8 of them. They walked out of the ruins together, and they did not look back. That was the thing about humans. The Veth had run the calculations on will and morale and breaking points, and they had arrived at their strategy with complete confidence. But they had missed something fundamental, something in the human makeup that did not show up in any of their models. Humans did not break when you killed the people they loved. Humans became something else entirely. Something harder, something colder, something that had made a decision and would not stop until the decision was carried out, or there was nothing left. The Veth had called it an extermination campaign. Humanity had a different name for what was coming. They called it justice. And it was 18 days away. 18 days was not a long time for most things. For building a war fleet, it was almost nothing. And yet, when Admiral Yuki Tanaka stood on the bridge of the heavy carrier Resolute and looked at the tactical display showing the positions of every ship under her command, she felt something close to awe. Not at herself, not at any decision she had made. She felt awe at people, at what people could do when they had no choice, and no doubt, and nothing left to lose. The fleet that had assembled around Mars was unlike anything humanity had ever put together in one place. There were proper warships, heavy cruisers, destroyers, carrier groups, ships that had been in service before the Veth arrived, and had been refitted and rearmed in the weeks since. But there were also the others, the ships that had no business being in a battle line and knew it, and showed up anyway. A mining hauler called Dusty Margaret had been stripped of her ore processing equipment and packed with every missile tube her crew could bolt onto her frame. She was ugly and slow, and her captain, a man named Darius, had painted a picture of his dead daughter on the hull, in blue and white. He had lost her on Callaway Station. A colony transport called New Dawn had been converted into a makeshift troop carrier. She could barely defend herself, but she could carry 3,000 soldiers to wherever they needed to go. Her crew were mostly civilians, who had retrained in 2 weeks, and looked terrified, and stood at their stations anyway. A private survey ship called Horizon's Edge had no weapons at all, but she was fast, the fastest ship in the fleet, and her navigator, a woman named Cass Ortega, had spent 15 years mapping the outer reaches of human space. She knew jump points that were not on any official chart. She had volunteered her ship as a scout. Tanaka had accepted every one of them. She stood at the tactical display and ran the numbers one more time. The Veth fleet outweighed hers in tonnage by a factor of 6. In raw firepower, the gap was worse. In shielding technology, in armor, in point defense systems, in almost every category that naval officers use to measure fighting power, the Veth were ahead, significantly ahead. But Tanaka had been thinking about something for 18 days. She had been thinking about it while she slept in 3-hour intervals, and while she ate standing up, and while she reviewed plan after plan from her staff. She had been thinking about the one thing the Veth had shown her that they did not understand. They thought in straight lines. Their attacks had been precise and methodical, the same pattern each time. Ships arrived. They formed a standard engagement formation. They bombarded from orbit. They moved on. It was efficient, it was deadly, and it was completely predictable. The Veth had never had a real fight. Not in 1,000 years. They had always won, before anyone could make them work for it. They did not know how to adapt. They did not know how to be surprised. Tanaka intended to surprise them. Dr. James Okafor was not a soldier. He was not even particularly brave, by his own honest assessment. He was a man who loved equations, and spent most of his time in a mental space made entirely of numbers and possibilities. He was the kind of person who forgot to eat, and then ate too much at once, and could not remember what day it was without checking 3 times. But when he walked into the weapons testing range on Titan, and watched the first prototype of his mass driver fire at a target panel 200 kilometers away, he felt something he had not expected to feel. He felt angry. The round hit the panel and went straight through it, and kept going. The panel was 3 meters of reinforced composite armor, the kind used on the outer hull of the heaviest warships in the fleet. The round went through it as if it was not there. His assistant, a young engineer named Priya, looked at the data feed and let out a long breath. "That worked," she said. "It worked," Okafor agreed. He was looking at where the panel used to be intact. His mind was doing what it always did, running the next calculation, seeing the next problem, pushing further. Can we make it bigger? How much bigger? Big enough to fit in a capital ship's forward turret. Priya looked at her notes. She looked at the wreckage of the target panel. She looked at Okafor. "Give me 4 days," she said. "You have 3, he told her. She gave him a look that said she did not appreciate that, and then she went to work. The weapon, which the engineers had taken to calling the Needle, because of how it looked and what it did, was based on a principle that most conventional weapons designers had dismissed as impractical. You could not accelerate a solid projectile to near light speed, without the energy requirements becoming absurd. That was true. Okafor had not solved that problem. What he had done was realize that you did not need near light speed. You needed a fraction of it. Even at 3% of light speed, a dense tungsten cord rod became something that no known armor could stop. The energy was not in the weapon system. The energy was in physics itself. You just had to be smart enough to tap into it. The Veth ships had heavy armor, very heavy armor. Their shields were excellent. But they had been designed to stop energy weapons, plasma bolts, laser batteries, high-yield missiles. Nobody had ever shot them with a tungsten rod moving at 2,700 kilometers per second. Okafor sent his final calculations to Admiral Tanaka with a note that said, "I think this will hurt them. I am sorry I could not make it hurt them faster." Tanaka read the note. She read the calculations. She forwarded both to her weapons teams with an order to begin installation on every ship that could carry the system, effective immediately. The Veth executor Vrail received a report that the human fleet was assembling, and felt something that was, for him, unusual. He was not concerned. The Veth fleet still massively outweighed any force the humans could put together. His projections showed the human fleet would be destroyed in a single engagement, or at most 2. But he was puzzled. The humans had said no. They had refused the surrender demand. And now, instead of collapsing, which was what every other species had done, they were building ships and preparing to fight. This was, by the Veth's calculation, completely irrational. The outcome was not in question. The humans could not win. Every number said so. Why were they fighting? He reviewed everything his analysts had gathered on human psychology and history. Humans had a long history of internal conflict. They had fought each other for most of their existence. They had developed a large number of weapons and a large number of reasons to use them. They were, by most metrics, a more violent species than average. But other violent species had surrendered. Violence was not a factor. What mattered was intelligence, and intelligent beings could calculate when a fight was unwinnable. Vrail studied the data. He looked at images from the colonies he had destroyed. He read the intercepted transmissions that humans had been sending each other, emotional communications, full of grief and rage and something else he did not have a word for, something that sounded like resolve. He flagged the transmissions for closer study and continued planning the next phase of his campaign. He did not find what he was looking for in the data. He could not, because what was driving humanity now was not a calculation. It was not a strategy. It was not even courage exactly. It was something simpler. Every human who had joined a recruitment line, every engineer working triple shifts in the shipyards, every scientist pushing their equations further than they had thought possible, all of them had the same image somewhere in the back of their mind. The faces from the transmissions that had come out of the dying colonies, the teacher with the child, the old man on the step, the young people who did not run. Those faces had become something. They had become the reason. Not an abstract reason, not a political one, a personal one, the kind that does not fade and does not negotiate. Vrail could not find this in the data, because it was not in the data. It was in the hearts of 11 billion people, and hearts did not transmit on any frequency his sensors could read. Sarah Vance reached Earth on the 22nd day after the fall of Arden's Rest. She came on a refugee transport with 400 other survivors from the colony, and she walked off the ship at the New Cairo spaceport with 8 people at her back, and a look in her eyes that the intake officer at the registration desk had seen more and more often in the past 3 weeks. He processed her paperwork quickly and pointed her toward the housing assignment center, and did not say anything unnecessary. She did not go to the housing center. She found the nearest military recruitment office, and walked in, and put her hands flat on the desk and said, "What do you need?" The recruiter, a tired sergeant with dark circles under his eyes, looked her up and down. He looked at the 8 people behind her. He looked at her student records, which had come through in her registration. Ecology degree, he said. That's not exactly a combat specialty. I know every plant and fungus and microorganism on 6 different colony worlds, she said. I know how to live off land that most people would say can't support life. I know how to navigate without instruments in 3 different biospheres. I can go places that most of your soldiers can't follow, and I can survive there indefinitely. She leaned forward slightly. What planet are you planning to take back first? The recruiter looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his comm and made a call. 20 minutes later, Sarah and her 8 companions were sitting across from a colonel from the new Special Operations Command, who was looking at them with an expression of concentrated interest. You were on Arden's Rest, the colonel said. Not a question. Yes, Sarah said. And you want to fight. I want to go back, she said, and I want to make sure that when we go back, we don't just push them off. I want to understand the ground. I want to know every inch of what we're fighting for. She paused, and I want to make sure they never forget what they did there. The colonel nodded slowly. He had heard a lot of speeches in the past 3 weeks. This was not a speech. This was a statement of intent, and he had learned, in 3 weeks, to tell the difference. We have a program, he said. Planetary reclamation units. People who know the terrain of the lost colonies. We need them to go back in with the assault teams and keep them oriented in environments that have been changed by bombardment. He looked at her. It's dangerous. Yes, she said. Most of the people in this program have military backgrounds. Good, she said. They can cover for me when I need it, and I'll cover for them when they need it. He gave her a small, tired smile. We'll need about 6 weeks of basic. You have 4, she said. He looked at her again. He thought about telling her that was not how it worked. Instead he said, agreed. In the weeks that followed, the human fleet completed its assembly, and Admiral Tanaka finalized her battle plan. It was not a plan that any conventional naval officer would have approved. It was chaotic in places. It relied on timing that had almost no margin for error. It used civilian ships in roles that they had not been designed for. It assumed that the Veth fleet commanders would react in the predictable way that they always had. But it also used the needle, and it used human speed of decision-making, and it used the fact that in human space, humans knew every rock and every shadow and every gravity well. Tanaka called a briefing for all senior commanders. She stood before them on the bridge of the Resolute, and she showed them the plan. When she was done, there was silence. Then Admiral Chen of the Second Fleet said, "This is insane." "Yes," Tanaka agreed. "It could work," said Commander Marsh. "It will work," said Captain Dariush of the Dusty Margaret. His voice was flat and certain, and nobody in the room questioned it. Tanaka looked at her commanders. At the faces, tired, grief-marked, determined faces, of the people who were going to carry this plan into the middle of a fleet that should destroy them by every rule of naval warfare. "They came here to erase us," she said. "They thought that killing the innocent would make the rest of us give up. They thought we would do the math and see that we couldn't win and stop fighting." She paused. They were wrong. Not because the math is different. The math says what it says. They were wrong because humans do not fight because the math says we can win. She let that sit for a moment. We fight because some things require it. And because we do not leave our dead unavenged. She turned to the tactical display. "We move in 48 hours. Get your crews ready." The commanders went to their ships. The fleet began its final preparations. 48 hours later, the largest human military force ever assembled crossed the boundary of the inner system and began moving toward the Veth. The Veth, who had been waiting for a surrender that was never going to come, saw them on their sensors and began recalculating. For the first time in 1,000 years, the Veth recalculated, not because they were surprised by the size of an enemy force, but because something about it was wrong, something that their systems could not quantify, something in the readings that made no logical sense. The human fleet was not advancing in a standard formation. It was not following any recognized combat doctrine. It was not, as far as Vrael's analysts could determine, following any doctrine at all. It was moving like something alive, like something angry, like something that had decided it had nothing left to lose and had chosen, very deliberately, to spend everything it had. Vrael stared at the display for a long time. "They are actually coming." his aide said quietly. Yes, Vrael said. He had run his calculations 1,000 times. He was still confident in the outcome. But for the first time, somewhere beneath the calculations, something shifted. Something that Veth did not often feel, and did not have a good word for. He looked at the advancing human fleet. He felt something like unease. He pushed it aside and began issuing orders. The battle was about to begin. The Veth called the engagement zone the Quiet Belt, a wide band of space between Mars and the asteroid fields, where their long-range sensors gave them perfect visibility, and their fleet could maneuver freely. Executor Vrael had positioned his main force there deliberately, in the same formation that had served the Veth in every engagement of the past 3 centuries. Ships in layers. Heavy bombardment vessels at the rear. Escort wings spread wide to catch anything trying to flank. The center anchored by the flagships, 3 massive dreadnoughts that carried enough firepower to crack open a small moon. It was a textbook formation, correct in every dimension a Veth admiral was trained to think about. Admiral Tanaka saw it on her display, and felt the corner of her mouth move. Not quite a smile, something harder than that. They set up exactly where I thought they would, she said. Commander Marsh stood at her shoulder. The formation's standard Veth doctrine, right out of the intercepts. Which means they haven't changed their thinking. She looked at the display for another moment. Good. She turned to her communications officer. All fleets, execute Phase 1. The human fleet did something the Veth did not expect. It split. Not into 2 groups, not into 3. It broke apart into more than 40 separate task groups, each one moving on a different vector, each one at a different speed, spreading across a volume of space large enough that the Veth targeting systems, designed to track concentrated fleet formations, were immediately overwhelmed with inputs. The Veth Fire Control AI began the process of reassigning targets and priorities, which was a computational task of enormous complexity. Because every human ship group was moving differently, and some of them were accelerating, and some were decelerating, and some were doing things that did not match any recognized tactical maneuver in the Veth database. Vrael watched his display fill with movement. What are they doing? He asked. None of his staff answered immediately, because none of them knew. The honest answer was that the human fleet was doing 6 different things at once. Tanaka had designed the plan in sections, each one depending on the others. Each one timed to force the Veth to make a decision before they had finished making the last one. She had given every task group commander a primary objective and 3 fallback objectives, and the authority to make their own tactical calls on the spot. She had told them, the plan is a framework. Inside the framework, think, I trust your judgment. This was not how the Veth commanded. Veth fleet doctrine put all decisions at the top. Vrael issued orders. His subordinates carried them out. There was no deviation. This worked very well when the enemy was behaving predictably. It worked very badly when 40 task groups were doing 40 different things, and each one required a specific response, and the response needed to come in the next 30 seconds, or the opportunity would be gone. Vrael's command staff began issuing orders. The orders were correct by Veth standards. They were just 30 seconds late. Task Group 7 was the ugliest collection of ships in the human fleet. It consisted of 4 old destroyers, 2 converted mining haulers, one of which was the Dusty Margaret, and a survey vessel that had no weapons at all and was just there to relay targeting data. Captain Darius commanded the group from the bridge of his hauler, surrounded by screens that showed him things his ship had not been built to see, with a crew that had been miners 3 weeks ago and were now the closest thing to a fighting unit this group had. Their job was simple to describe, and very hard to do. They were going to go after the escorts. The Veth escort wings were fast attack ships, not as well armored as the big vessels, but faster and more agile, and equipped with close-range weapons that made them extremely dangerous to anything smaller than a cruiser. They were the teeth of the Veth formation, meant to chew up anything that got close to the main body. Tanaka had not sent cruisers to deal with them. She had sent Darius. Her logic was this: the escort ships expected to be attacked by warships. They knew how warships moved, they knew how warships fired, they knew the engagement ranges and the approach vectors. A converted mining hauler with jury-rigged missile tubes bolted to its hull was not in any of their models. It moved wrong. It accelerated wrong. When Darius pushed his engines past safe limits and drove his ship at an angle that no warship captain would ever choose. The Veth targeting systems registered the movement as an error and delayed the lock for 4 crucial seconds. 4 seconds was enough. The Dusty Margaret fired every missile she had in 2 salvos. Then she turned hard and ran, her engines screaming, while the destroyers came in from the other side and used those same 4 seconds to close to knife fight range. 3 Veth escort ships were gone before Vrael's staff had finished their first round of orders. On the other side of the engagement zone, something quieter was happening. The survey ship Horizon's Edge, piloted by Cass Ortega, was threading a path through the asteroid belt on the edge of the quiet belt. She was moving very slowly and very carefully, using the rocks to break up her thermal signature, keeping herself below the Veth sensor horizon. She had no weapons. She was not there to fight. She was there to make a phone call. At a precise moment, the moment Tanaka had specified to the second, Ortega powered up her communications array and sent a very specific signal on a very specific frequency. The signal bounced off 3 relay buoys that had been placed in the belt by a scout team 3 days earlier and came out on the other side of the Veth formation. The signal said, "We see you," but it was not directed at the Veth. It was directed at the 12 human ships that had been sitting absolutely dark and cold in the asteroid belt for 60 hours, waiting. No engine output, no active sensors, minimal life support. 12 crews sitting in near darkness, rationing heat, breathing carefully, doing nothing, for 60 hours. They were not warships either, they were freighters. Very large freighters, the kind that moved raw materials between star systems. Each one of them had been packed with a very specific cargo. Needle rounds. Hundreds of them. Preloaded in improvised magnetic launchers that had been welded to their cargo bays over 3 days of frantic work. The launchers were not precise. They were not elegant. They were the work of engineers who had been told, "We need the biggest possible gun. We need it in 3 days, and we need it to hit something the size of a city." The engineers had delivered. When Ortega's signal reached them, all 12 freighters lit their engines simultaneously and turned toward the rear of the Veth formation, toward the heavy bombardment vessels that had been sitting safely at the back, fully shielded, waiting to finish the engagement once the escorts had cleared the way. Nobody had ever attacked those ships from behind. There was no route to behind them. The asteroid belt was on that side. You could not bring a fleet through an asteroid belt. You could not bring a fleet through. You could bring 12 freighters through, if you had a navigator who had spent 15 years learning where the gaps were. The freighters opened fire. The first needle round hit a Veth bombardment vessel amidships. The ship was 3 kilometers long, and armored with the best material the Veth had developed over 1,000 years of weapons engineering. Its shields were layered and redundant. Nothing in any battle the Veth had ever fought had penetrated both the shields and the armor in a single hit. The needle round went through the shields as if they were not there. It went through 4 layers of armor. It went through the crew compartments in the center section. It went through the reactor housing. It exited through the far side. The ship did not explode immediately. It took 8 seconds. The crew did not have time to understand what had happened. Then it exploded, in pieces. Large, slow pieces that tumbled through space and struck 2 neighboring ships and damaged both of them. The second needle round hit 30 seconds later. Then the third. The 12 freighters were not fast and they were not maneuverable, but they were firing from 700 kilometers, and the bombardment ships had no idea anything was behind them and were not pointed the right way to bring their own weapons to bear. In the Veth flagship, every alarm went off at once. Vrael stood at his display and watched 3 of his bombardment vessels die in less than 2 minutes and felt, for the first time in his career, something that was not confidence. "Where is that fire coming from?" he said. "The asteroid belt," his weapons officer reported. The disbelief in his voice was clear. "They came through the belt." Vrael stared at the data. "That is not possible. The readings are. I know what the readings say." He looked at the positions of the human task groups. He looked at what they were doing. He looked at the freighters firing from his rear, and the destroyers in his escort flank, and the groups he had not yet accounted for, which were now moving in ways that suggested they had secondary objectives he had not predicted. For the first time, his command picture was not clear to him. For the first time, Vrael did not know what was going to happen next. On the Resolute, Tanaka watched the Phase 1 results come in and did not celebrate. There was no time. Phase 2, she said. The heavy cruiser groups that had been hanging back, the ships that looked like the reserve, the part of the fleet that anyone watching would have assumed was being saved for a counterattack response, began to move. They had not been saved. They had been positioned. And the position they moved to was the one that the Veth escort wing had just vacated, because the escort wing was busy dealing with Darius and the destroyers. The cruisers hit the flank of the Veth main body at full speed with everything they had, not trying to destroy, just trying to push, to drive the Veth formation off its axis, to take away the geometry that made the formation strong, to make Vrael choose between defending his flank and responding to the freighters in his rear and managing the chaos in his escort wings. To make him choose. Because Tanaka knew something about choosing. She knew that every choice you forced on an enemy was a moment you took from them, and moments, in a fleet engagement, were everything. Vrael chose to respond to the cruisers first. He redirected 3 of his remaining heavy ships. That was the wrong choice. He did not know it was wrong yet. By the time he knew, he would have made 2 more wrong choices, each one forced by the pressure from a different direction, each one creating a new gap that the human task groups would fill. This was Tanaka's plan. Not to beat the Veth fleet head-on, she could not do that, not with what she had, but to make them react, to turn their strength into a liability by giving them too many problems at once, and making sure every solution created another problem. It was not a plan that had a clear endpoint. It was a living thing, and it depended on her commanders making good decisions faster than the Veth commanders could make any decisions at all. It was working. Sarah Vance was not in the battle. She was on a transport 12 light minutes away, moving toward the first reclamation target with her team and 200 soldiers from the 14th Assault Division. She could see the battle on the tactical feed, just position markers and status updates, dry numbers that could not carry the full weight of what they represented. She watched the numbers and thought about what they meant. She had been through 4 weeks of compressed basic training that had been 3 weeks of the hardest physical and mental work of her life. She had learned to use a weapon, and how to move under fire, and how to read terrain in the dark. She had also taught 30 soldiers from the 14th Division everything she knew about the ecosystems of Arden's Rest, the soil types, the water sources, the sheltered valleys where a person could survive if the surface was too dangerous. She had taught them the colony. The real colony, the one you could not see on a map, the one that lived in the details of the ground and the smell of the air and the way the light hit the fields in the morning. She had taught them because she intended to go back, not as a refugee, not to look at the ruins. To take it back, piece by piece, valley by valley, building by building, if that was what it took. The transport hummed around her. Her team, the 8 survivors of New Lisbon and 20 others who had joined them in training, sat in silence, not the silence of fear. The silence of people who had thought everything through and made their decision, and were now just waiting for the door to open. The colonel from Special Operations Command had told her once, in a quiet moment, that he had never seen civilians become soldiers as fast as the colony survivors. She had told him, they are not becoming soldiers, they are becoming themselves. There is a difference. He had thought about that for a moment, and then nodded. In the quiet belt, the battle entered its 3rd hour. The Veth had lost 9 ships. 6 bombardment vessels, 4 from the Needles and 2 from the cruiser strike, and 3 escorts that had been caught in the crossfire of Darius's group and the destroyers. They had damaged 23 human ships in return, and destroyed 4 outright, including one of the converted freighters that had been caught when Vrael finally realigned his rear guard. By pure numbers, the Veth were still ahead. They still had more firepower, more armor, more ships. On paper, they were winning. But Vrael knew, in a way he had never known anything quite like this before, that something was wrong. His formation was no longer a formation. It was a collection of ships trying to respond to 17 different threats simultaneously, and doing all of it poorly. His commanders were waiting for orders that came too slowly, because he was processing too many inputs. His escort wing had fragmented. His bombardment vessels, the heart of his strategy, the weapons that were supposed to end this engagement quickly, were either destroyed or repositioned defensively, which meant they were not doing the thing they were built to do. He was not losing. but he was not winning the way he was supposed to win. He was not winning cleanly, he was winning messily, slowly, at a cost that was higher than any calculation he had run before this battle had predicted. And the humans were not stopping. That was the thing that his models had not predicted. He had run scenarios in which the human fleet took heavy losses and then disengaged, retreated to regroup, which was the rational response. He had run scenarios in which the human fleet concentrated its force and tried to break through the center. He had run scenarios in which they formed a defensive perimeter. He had not run a scenario in which they just kept coming. From every direction, through every gap, with ships that had no business being in a battle, with weapons he had never seen before, with tactics that made no sense and then suddenly made terrible sense 3 minutes after they started. He stared at his display. Casualties are mounting, his aide reported. Recommend regrouping the main body. To where? Vrael said. His aide paused. That was the problem. Every position they could regroup to was covered by a human task group. Not because the humans had enough ships to cover everything, they did not, but because the human commanders were choosing the right places to be, with an instinct that Vrael's models had not accounted for. He looked at his display for a long time. Then, for the first time in his command career, he sent an order to withdraw. Not retreat. Withdraw. There was a distinction in Veth military language, and he chose the precise word carefully, because words mattered, and he was not yet ready to call this what it was starting to look like. But as his ships began to pull back toward their secondary position, and as the human fleet followed, not in a pursuit but in a continued expansion, filling every space the Veth vacated, Vrael looked at the numbers again, and felt the unease from before return. It was heavier now. It had weight. He pushed it aside again. He still had 3 times the firepower. He still had the dreadnoughts, untouched. The humans had surprised him. They would not surprise him again. He would adjust. He would recalculate. He would win. But as he issued his new orders and watched his fleet reposition, he noticed something about the human fleet movements that stopped him cold for just a moment. They were not following him randomly. They were following him in a specific pattern. A pattern that, as he studied it, looked almost like they knew where he was going before he went there. He called his intelligence officer. "Has there been any indication of a breach in our communications?" he asked. The officer checked. "No. Our quantum encryption is intact." Vrael looked at the display. The human fleet was moving into position around his new formation before his own ships had fully arrived. "Then how?" he said quietly, to no one in particular. "Do they know?" Nobody answered. The battle moved into its 4th hour, and somewhere in the asteroid belt, in the dark, Cass Ortega read her navigator's display and smiled. She had spent 15 years learning the shape of space out here. She knew every rock. She knew every shadow. She knew exactly where a fleet retreating from the quiet belt would go, because there were only 3 places with enough open space to maneuver in, and she had given Admiral Tanaka the map of all 3 before the battle started. Horizon's Edge adjusted course and headed for the next relay position. The next act was about to begin, and Vrael did not sleep. The Veth did not sleep the way humans did, but they had periods of low mental activity, rest cycles that kept their thinking sharp. Vrael had not taken a rest cycle in 60 hours. He stood at his command display and studied the battle that was no longer going according to any plan he recognized, and tried to find the pattern. Because there had to be a pattern. Everything had a pattern. You found the pattern, you understood the system, you controlled the outcome. This was the Veth way of thinking. It had served them for 1,000 years. He looked at the human fleet movements. He looked at them in aggregate, in detail, in time sequence. He ran his analysis algorithms across the data and asked them to find the underlying doctrine. The algorithms gave him 17 different possible doctrines, with confidence levels ranging from 12% to 31%. 31% was the highest confidence his analysis systems had ever returned for an enemy tactical doctrine. He stared at that number. The answer was not in the number. The answer was what the number meant. 31% meant his systems had found a partial match, something that looked like a recognizable doctrine in some dimensions and looked completely different in others. Not because the humans were using multiple doctrines, because they were using no doctrine at all. They were improvising. Every task group was making its own decisions based on what it saw in the moment. There was a broad shape to the overall plan. He could see that. But inside that shape, every commander was acting independently, reading the battle as it developed, choosing the response that seemed right to them right now, not the response that fit into a predetermined sequence. This was, from a Veth military perspective, a catastrophically bad way to fight a battle. It should have produced chaos. It should have produced friendly fire incidents and wasted opportunities, and ships in the wrong places at the wrong times. Instead, it produced adaptability. Every time Vrael made a move, the human response was different, because different commanders were reacting to different things, and some of them were doing things he had not expected, and the cumulative effect of all those unexpected things was a battle that looked different every 10 minutes. He could not get ahead of it. He could only react. And reacting was losing. Not quickly, not obviously, but steadily. On the 4th day of the battle, something happened that changed the calculations permanently. The 3 Veth dreadnoughts, which Vrael had kept in reserve throughout the engagement, partly as a strategic reserve, partly because he was reluctant to commit his most powerful assets until he understood what he was dealing with, finally moved. Vrael had made a decision. He was going to end this. The human fleet was still fighting, still pressing, still refusing to break, but the losses on both sides were mounting, and his losses were becoming difficult to sustain. He had entered this battle with resources sufficient to destroy Earth and every inhabited world in human space. He still had more than enough, but the rate at which those resources were diminishing was not what he had projected, and each passing hour made his model of the conflict less reliable. He was going to commit the dreadnoughts. He was going to drive them into the center of the human formation, the loose, distributed center that had no hard core to protect, and he was going to break it from the inside. The dreadnoughts began their advance. They were the most powerful things the Veth had ever built. 3 ships, each one 4 kilometers from bow to stern, armored so heavily that conventional weapons simply stopped against their hulls. Their main batteries could destroy a cruiser with a single shot at ranges that made return fire almost impossible. They had been in every major Veth engagement for the past 2 centuries, and they had never been seriously threatened. They moved through the battle space, and the human ships that saw them coming, those that could move, pulled back. Not in panic. Carefully, deliberately, maintaining formation, giving ground without breaking, like something that knew what it was doing. Tanaka watched the dreadnoughts move and felt something she had not expected to feel. Relief. They committed the dreadnoughts, Marsh said from beside her. Yes, she said. That means they think they need them. It means they're worried. She was already moving to the tactical display. Phase 4. Phase 4 was not something she had told her fleet commanders about in detail. She had told them it existed. She had told them that when the dreadnoughts moved, they would receive new orders. Those orders had been sealed. Now she unsealed them. Dr. Okafor had not only built the needle, he had also built something he called, with quiet understatement, the big needle. The standard needle was a weapon that fit in a capital ship's forward turret. It was devastating against normal warships. Against a dreadnought, Okafor's calculations suggested it would do serious damage but might not penetrate the deepest armor layers. The big needle was different. It was not a ship weapon. It was a weapon that was a ship. Or rather, it had been a ship once. A very old bulk freighter called the Perseverance, that had been in service for 40 years and was scheduled for decommissioning. Her drives had been rebuilt to push her to speeds she had never been designed for. Her cargo hold had been entirely replaced by a single continuous magnetic accelerator running the full 2-kilometer length of her hull. At the end of that accelerator sat a rod of depleted uranium alloyed with dense materials that Okafor's team had spent 2 weeks compressing, in a process that he refused to explain to non-physicists, because the explanation took 4 hours. The Perseverance was not crewed. She had an AI navigation system and a human operator sitting in a shielded pod attached to her hull, outside the main weapon system, controlling her remotely. That human operator was a 22-year-old ensign named Tobias Park, who had been a competitive drone racing pilot before the war, and who had volunteered for this specific mission, after reading the specification document, and then sitting alone in a room for an hour, and then coming back and saying, "I can fly that." Okafor had met with him once. He had looked at the young man and thought about what he was asking of him, and he had said, "You understand that when you fire this weapon, the recoil will be sufficient to destroy the Perseverance and everything attached to her." Tobias had said, How accurate is the targeting? At the ranges involved, within 15 meters. Then it'll work, Tobias said. Okafor had not been able to find an argument against that. The Perseverance had been sitting, dark and cold, in a stable orbit around one of the outer asteroids for 12 days. When Phase 4 orders went out, her AI navigation system lit up, and she began to move. Tobias, sitting in his pod, checked his systems, and began calculating his firing solution. He needed to get within range. Range for the big needle was much longer than conventional weapons. The physics of the system required it, but, within range, still meant closer than he wanted to be, to three things that could destroy him just by pointing their guns in his direction. He flew the Perseverance, using the chaos of the battle as cover. The battle was chaos enough. Ships moving everywhere, energy weapons crossing the space between them, debris from destroyed vessels tumbling in long arcs. Tobias threaded his ship through all of it, with the instincts of someone who had spent 5 years racing drones through obstacle courses that moved. He got to position. He identified his target, the lead dreadnought, designated Alpha by the human fleet, and he held his firing solution for 43 seconds, making small corrections, waiting for the moment when the geometry was exactly right. Then he fired. The big needle left the Perseverance at a velocity that expressed itself as light, a brief flash visible across thousands of kilometers of space. The recoil hit the Perseverance simultaneously from the other direction, at equal and opposite force, and she came apart exactly as the calculations said she would. Tobias's pod was thrown clear on its emergency thrusters, spinning wildly, his systems momentarily scrambled by the electromagnetic pulse of the firing. He recovered, he stabilized. He looked at the feed from the nearest relay beacon. The round hit the lead dreadnought in the forward third of its hull. The dreadnought's shields, designed for energy weapons, registered the round too late. The round was solid mass, moving at a speed the shields were not built to deflect. It went through. What happened next was complicated by physics. The round's kinetic energy transferred into the armored hull, and the hull absorbed part of it, and transmitted part of it through the internal structure. As a catastrophic shockwave, the armored sections did not breach cleanly. They fragmented. The internal bulkheads, designed to contain explosive decompression events, were not designed for a shockwave traveling faster than the structural material could respond. The lead dreadnought broke in half. Not from an explosion, not from fire. From the simple transfer of energy from something very small moving very fast into something very large that was not expecting it. It broke in half, and both halves kept moving on their original vector, and then, as their drives and reactor containment systems lost coherence, they stopped moving and became very bright briefly, and then stopped being bright and became dark. Vrael watched the lead dreadnought die. He stood very still and watched it happen, and did not say anything for a long time. His aide said his name. He did not respond. The second and third dreadnoughts were still advancing. Their commanders were sending emergency queries. They were asking what had fired. They were asking where the shot came from. They were asking for protective protocols. Vrael finally looked at his aide. "Pull them back," he said. "The dreadnoughts? All ships, pull everything back." His aide hesitated. This was not a tactical withdrawal to a secondary position. This was something different. He could hear it in Vrael's voice. To what coordinates? Past the boundary. Pull back past the outer boundary. He paused. "Get me an emergency strategic council. Now." His aide went to work. Around him, the command staff began the process of signaling the withdrawal. Vrael stood at his display and looked at the position of the human fleet. They were following. Of course they were following. They had followed every withdrawal. They did not stop. He thought about the weapon that had killed his dreadnought. He thought about the mining hauler with the missiles. He thought about the freighters in the asteroid belt. He thought about the destroyers that had hit his escort wing in ways that no standard destroyer doctrine would have sent them. He thought about the one-word reply to his surrender demand. He thought about 40 million dead civilians and how, instead of breaking the humans' will to fight, it had apparently done the opposite. In 1,000 years, no species had made the Veth rethink a campaign mid-execution. The Veth won and moved on. That was the pattern. That was the only pattern there had ever been. He looked at the data from the engagement. His ships destroyed, 19. Human ships destroyed, 31. By pure numbers, he was still ahead. By any military accounting he knew how to do, he had the advantage. But the battle was 12 hours old, and the humans were not stopping, and his models, the models that had never been wrong, were now returning results he could not trust. He had made this decision once before, long ago, as a young strategist assigned to a review of historical Veth campaigns. There had been a species, extinct now, extinct because of the Veth, though they had taken longer than expected to fall, that had refused to surrender, even when the mathematics made surrender the only logical choice. It had taken 3 times the projected resources to eliminate them. He had noted that in his review as an inefficiency, a minor one. The species was gone now. The campaign had ended as all campaigns ended. He stood at his display, and the unease was very heavy now, not pushed aside, not managed, just present. He called the Strategic Council. He was going to have to say something that no Veth executor had said in 1,000 years. He was going to have to say, "I need more ships." The human fleet had taken serious losses. 31 ships destroyed, 47 more damaged to varying degrees. Over 9,000 crew dead. The numbers were real, and they were heavy, and nobody on the Resolute pretended otherwise. But the Veth had pulled back past the outer boundary for the first time. Tanaka stood at her display, and looked at the space they had pushed them to, and breathed. "They stopped," Marsh said. "For now," she said. "They'll regroup. They'll come back with more." She was quiet for a moment. But they didn't expect to regroup. They expected to be done by now. We changed their expectations. We changed their whole picture of what this war is. She looked at the casualty numbers, the human ones, the ones with names attached if you scrolled down. She let herself look at them for exactly as long as she could stand to look at them. Then she turned away. "Get me a full fleet status report. I want to know what we have left and what condition it's in. And then we use it." In the silence that followed, one of her communications officers looked up from his station. "Admiral, we're picking up a transmission from the surface of Arden's Rest." Tanaka went very still. Arden's Rest was destroyed. "Yes, ma'am. The signal is coming from ground level. Someone on the surface is using an emergency beacon, modified as a data transmitter." She crossed to his station. On the screen, a shaky video feed was playing. A woman's face, visible briefly in low light. Behind her, ruins. The sky above was the sky of a dead colony. Smoke and ash and the long silence after violence. But the woman was standing up. She was not hiding. She was looking at the camera with an expression that was not grief, or not only grief. She was speaking in a low, clear voice. "We are still here," she was saying. "We are still on Arden's Rest. 11 of us. We are still here, and we want to tell anyone who is listening that this place is not gone. It is wounded. It is not gone. Come back for us. We will be here." Tanaka watched the feed for a long moment. Then she made a decision. "Get me Commander Marsh and a direct line to Special Operations Command," she said. "We are going to get those people off that rock." She paused. "And we are going to start taking back what we lost." On the surface of Arden's Rest, Sarah Vance did not know that her transmission had been picked up. She turned off the beacon. Battery power was limited, and went back to where her team was sheltering in the ruins of a stone building that had been someone's home once, and would be again. She sat down against the wall and looked at the stars through the hole in the ceiling. The stars did not look the same as they had before. They used to look peaceful, like something to travel toward. Now they looked like territory. She thought about what she had seen from here, the Veth ships moving away, not in the methodical precision of a fleet completing its mission, but in the uncertain movement of something that had been hurt and was trying to understand what had hurt it. She had seen it from the surface, and she had understood what it meant before any tactical analysis could have confirmed it. They were not as certain as they had been. She closed her eyes and let herself sleep for an hour. Just 1 hour. Her body demanded it. She slept, and in her sleep she dreamed about the fields of Arden's Rest before the burning, green and long in the morning light, with the river running clear through the valley, and children by the water, the way it had been, the way it would be again. She was going to make sure of that personally. In the Emergency Strategic Council of the Veth, Vriel presented his assessment. His colleagues listened in silence. They were 9 of the most powerful beings in the Veth civilization. They had never been called together for an emergency session. They had never needed to be. Campaigns ended. They had always ended the same way. When Vrail finished speaking, there was a long pause. "You are saying," one of his colleagues said, "that they cannot be broken." "I am saying that the methods we used have not broken them," Vrail said carefully. "I am saying that the methods we expected to break them have, in my current assessment, made them more effective fighters, not less. You killed 40 million of their civilians." "Yes. And the remaining 11 billion have responded by building a war fleet in 18 days, and fighting it more effectively than any enemy we have encountered in 3 centuries of active campaigns." Another pause. "What do you recommend?" Vrail looked at his colleagues. He thought about 1,000 years of Veth history. He thought about the calculations he had run, and the calculations that were now running, and what they were telling him, that he did not want to hear. "I recommend," he said, "that we consider the possibility that this campaign requires a different approach." "Different how?" He looked at the display, at the position of the human fleet, and the boundary they had pushed his forces to, and the 12 worlds of human space still intact, and the planet Earth at the center of all of it, small and blue and still there. "I do not yet know," he admitted. For a Veth executor, admitting he did not know something was nearly unheard of. In the room, something shifted. An old certainty had developed a crack. Not a break, not yet, but a crack. The council adjourned without a resolution, and the human fleet held its position at the boundary, damaged and depleted, waiting, and not breaking. Still not breaking. The Veth took 6 weeks to regroup. In those 6 weeks, humanity did not rest. It would be wrong to say that humanity flourished during those weeks. Flourishing requires peace, and there was no peace. There was grief everywhere. There were 40 million dead, and the ruins of 5 colony worlds and empty chairs at tables across 11 billion lives. There were nights when the weight of what had happened was so heavy that people sat in the dark and could not find words for it. There were mornings when ordinary things, breakfast, the sound of birds, a child's voice, felt unbearable in their smallness compared to the scale of what had been lost. But humanity worked. It worked the way it had always worked when the alternative was extinction. The factories ran. The shipyards ran. Dr. Okafor's team, which had grown from a handful of engineers to 400 people across 7 facilities, refined the needle technology and built more of them, and built them into ships that had been designed from the beginning to carry them, not retrofitted. The AI logistics systems that had been rebuilt to support the war effort were now so integrated with the human industrial base that they were finding efficiencies nobody had asked for and nobody had thought of. Things moved. Things got built. Things got better in the specific way that things get better when people stop worrying about what is possible and start worrying about what is necessary. Admiral Tanaka used the 6 weeks to rebuild her fleet and train the people in it. She ran exercises, endless exercises. She pushed her task group commanders to think faster and trust their instincts more. She brought in civilian experts, engineers, physicists, logistics specialists, and put them in the same rooms as her naval officers, and made them talk to each other, until the knowledge that lived in one group started to live in the other group too. She read everything her intelligence teams gathered on the Veth. She read it twice. She read it with the specific intention of finding the thing that was not in the data, the shape of what was missing. She found it. The Veth, in 1,000 years of campaigns, had never lost. That was the thing. Not that they were powerful. She already knew they were powerful. Not that they had better technology. She was working on that. The critical thing was that they had never lost, and they did not know what to do with the experience of losing. They did not have a model for it. Their command structure was built on the assumption of eventual victory. When victory was uncertain, when the outcome was not guaranteed, and every decision was a bet instead of a calculation, they slowed down. They convened councils. They argued. They waited for clarity that did not come. Humans, on the other hand, had spent their entire history fighting with uncertain outcomes, and had developed something for it. An ability to keep moving when the path was not clear. To make a decision with incomplete information, and live with the consequences, and make the next decision. To adapt, not just in tactics but in spirit. She wrote a note to herself. They think better than us in peacetime. We think better in chaos. Make more chaos. Then she went back to planning. Sarah Vance came back to Arden's Rest on a cold Tuesday morning, with the 14th Assault Division and a team of 40 specialists, and the specific intention of staying. She came in on a landing craft that dropped fast through the gray sky and hit the ground running, and the thing she noticed first was the smell. Not bad, exactly, just the smell of a world healing. Rain had fallen since the bombardment. The ash had been pressed into the ground by months of weather, and through the gray crust, in the places where the soil was not too badly burned, thin green was starting to show. The kind of green that does not care about what happened, the kind that just grows. She walked through what had been New Lisbon, and she did not look away from the ruins. She looked directly at them. She catalogued them. She was a scientist, and she used her scientist's mind, and she made notes about the structural damage patterns, and the soil contamination levels, and the things that could be reclaimed, and the things that could not. She was efficient about it, clinical. But she held each piece of it. She did not let herself go numb. She had decided that she would not go numb. She would let it hurt, and she would keep working anyway, because the alternative was to make herself smaller than the people who had died here, and she was not willing to do that. The 11 survivors who had transmitted from the surface came to meet her. They looked thinner than they should, and their eyes had the look that people got when they had been too long alone, with something too big to carry. Sarah shook each of their hands. She didn't say much. She didn't have to. Then she got to work. The reclamation teams spread out across the colony. The soldiers established a perimeter and then relaxed their perimeter, because there was nothing here for the Veth. They had left weeks ago. The planet was of no strategic value to them, just a ruin they had passed through. The engineers began assessing the physical infrastructure. The environmental specialists took samples of the soil and the water. Sarah walked the valley where she had grown up and identified the areas where the native ecosystem was trying to reassert itself and marked them for protection. It was small work, quiet work. The opposite of the battle that was still being fought in the outer system. But it was the reason the battle was being fought. She knew that. Every person on every ship in Admiral Tanaka's fleet knew it, even if they did not think about it in those specific terms. They were fighting for the right to do exactly this, to come back to a broken place and start making it not broken. The Veth came back on the 43rd day after the first battle. They came with a larger fleet, twice the size of the first. More bombardment vessels, more escorts, new ship types that human intelligence had not seen before. Long, narrow vessels that moved with unusual speed, and had weapons that burned at a different frequency than standard Veth energy weapons. They also came differently. They did not form the standard layered formation that Tanaka had exploited before. They came in distributed groups that held each other at longer range, covering multiple vectors simultaneously. Someone had thought about what had gone wrong and made adjustments. Tanaka saw this and respected it and started recalculating. She had a larger fleet too, better armed, better trained, 15 more ships carrying needle systems, and one other thing, something she had kept completely quiet about, because operational security demanded it, and because she was not yet sure it would work. Dr. Okafor had been building something for 6 weeks, using the data from the first battle, something that addressed the specific problem of the Veth shields, which had stopped energy weapons reliably, and had only failed against mass driver rounds. He had been thinking about this problem with the part of his mind that never stopped thinking, and he had come to a conclusion. The shields failed against solid mass at high velocity, but a ship could only carry so many mass driver rounds. What if the mass driver round was not a round at all? He had called Tanaka 3 weeks ago and said, in his quiet way, "I have something to show you." She had flown to Titan personally. He had shown her. She had looked at it for a long time without speaking. It was a drone. A small one, smaller than a person, shaped like a simplified teardrop. It had no weapons. It had a drive system that was essentially stolen from the needle concept, a very small mass moving very fast, and it had a very simple AI and a very simple sensor package. By itself, it could not hurt anything significant. But if you built 20,000 of them and released them all at once in the path of an incoming fleet, and if they were moving fast enough, and if they aimed themselves at the shield emitters specifically, not the ships, the shield emitters, which were on the outside and not particularly armored because shields were the armor. Tanaka had said, "When can you have them ready?" Okafor had looked at his team, who were all listening, and he had said, "We've had 4 weeks already. We need 2 more. 2 more weeks." She had budgeted for it. Now the swarm was loaded in the bays of 6 carrier ships in the rear of her formation, and the Veth fleet was on approach, and Tanaka was standing at her display running the same calculation she always ran before an engagement, not the calculation about winning or losing, but the calculation about cost. How many people was she going to spend today? She never had a good answer for that. She just did it anyway. All fleets, she said. Battle formation. Execute. The second battle lasted 4 days. Later, people who wrote histories of the war would spend a lot of words on the tactical details of those 4 days. They would analyze the drone swarm deployment, which worked catastrophically well for the Veth ships that found themselves with their shield emitters suddenly destroyed and their hulls exposed to needle fire, and the flanking action that Darius and his hauler executed for the second time, somehow surviving again, somehow finding a way through, earning himself a nickname in the fleet that he did not know about until after the war was over. They would write about the moment when the 3 new Veth ship types, the fast, narrow ones, broke through the human line and drove deep toward the Resolute herself, and the response of Commander Marsh, who took 4 destroyers on a course that should have killed all of them, and instead killed all 3 Veth ships, and brought 3 of his 4 destroyers home. They would write about the way the human fleet learned in real time, adapting to the new Veth tactics in hours, instead of the days it would have taken a more rigid force. But the thing that historians would keep coming back to, the detail that kept appearing in accounts written by people who were there, was not a tactical detail. It was a moment near the end of the second day of fighting, when the Veth fleet, which had been holding its reformed formation against everything the human fleet was doing, suddenly stopped holding. Not a withdrawal, not a planned regroup, a break. The Veth formation broke. The heavy vessels in the center, the ones that had been maintaining the distributed spacing that Vrael's revised doctrine required, began moving toward each other instead of holding their positions. They were trying to consolidate, to mass their firepower. It was a move that made tactical sense in isolation. But it required the escort wings to pull in from the flanks, and when the escort wings pulled in, the flanks opened, and Tanaka had been waiting for exactly this moment for 6 hours, had been applying pressure with exactly the right amount of force to make exactly this happen, and when it happened she was ready. Every task group that had been pressing on the flanks shifted simultaneously. The gap in the Veth formation widened. Human ships poured into it, not in the standard way, not in a charge toward the center, but in a curving, spiraling movement that turned the gap into an encirclement. It happened in 30 minutes. The Veth formation went from a consolidated defensive posture to a situation where 30 of their heavy ships were surrounded by human vessels on 4 sides, and the rest of their fleet was outside the encirclement, trying to get back in. Vrael, watching from his flagship, understood what had happened. He had been manipulated into this position over 6 hours, by pressure that had looked like harassment, and was actually choreography. He gave the order to break out. It cost him 23 ships. The remaining Veth fleet, still formidable, still dangerous, but bleeding, retreated past the outer boundary again. This time, Tanaka followed them. She followed them past the boundary. Past the outer system, into the dark between stars where no battle had been fought before, where the only light came from the engines of fleeing ships, and the weapons of the ships chasing them. Not all the way, not to the Veth home system. She did not have enough, not yet. But far enough to send a message. The message was not words, it was position. It was the fact that human ships were here, in space that the Veth had considered safely their own, and they were not leaving, and they were not asking permission. She held her position for 6 hours, then she turned and came home. In the Veth Council, Vrael made his second report. This one was shorter. He had fewer things to explain, because the situation was simpler now. Simpler and worse. "We have lost 41 ships in 2 engagements," he said. "We have failed to destroy or significantly degrade the human fleet. Their losses are substantial, but they continue to replace them. Their weapons technology has improved significantly in the period between engagements. There is no indication that their will to continue fighting has decreased." He paused. "I must tell you something that I have been calculating since the first engagement and have spent 6 weeks hoping was wrong." The council waited. "Our models," Vrael said, "were built on a single assumption. The assumption was that the will of a civilization to fight is a fixed resource. You deplete it, and the civilization surrenders. We depleted it in 40 million lives, and the resource did not deplete. It expanded. He let that sit. I have been reviewing human history in the weeks since the first battle. They have fought each other for their entire civilized existence. Every account of their major conflicts says the same thing. When they lose people, they do not run out of will. They make more of it. The grief becomes the fuel. The anger becomes the engine. He looked at his colleagues. We did not understand what we were fighting. What do you recommend? Vrael was quiet for a long time. I recommend, he said finally, that we open communication. The silence in the council chamber was of a quality that had never existed there before. You are recommending negotiation, one of his colleagues said. The word came out carefully, as if it were something unfamiliar. I am recommending that we consider it. We have never negotiated. We have never negotiated. He looked at the display, at the projected trajectory of the war, if both sides continued at current rates. We will need to. The transmission came through, on a frequency that humanity's deep space monitoring network had been watching since the first attack. It was tight beam, directed at Earth, in a format that the AI translation systems were able to decode in 11 hours. Secretary General Amara Osei read the translation in her office at 4 in the morning, alone. The Veth were requesting communication, not surrender, not the surrender of humanity. The Veth were requesting a conversation. She sat with that for a long time. Then she called Admiral Tanaka. Then she called her council. Then she went to the window and looked at the pre-dawn sky. Still dark, stars still visible. The same stars that had carried the Veth ships to her people's worlds. And she thought. She thought about 40 million people. She thought about the teachers, and the farmers, and the children, and the old man on his step. She thought about Arden's Rest, and Callaway Station, and New Meridian. She thought about every empty chair at every table across 100 worlds. She thought about what the right answer was. It was not a simple answer. It was not a satisfying one. She was a doctor before she was a politician, and doctors knew that the point was not the anger, or the grief, or even the justice, in the end. The point was what happened next. The point was survival. The point was making sure that the people still living got to keep living. She replied to the transmission herself. She wrote the reply by hand. She said, "We will talk, but we will talk from a position we choose, at a time we choose, with conditions we set." She said, "You came to our space uninvited, and killed our people without cause. You will acknowledge this, not as a condition for discussion, as a fact that exists regardless of what you acknowledge. We know what you did. The galaxy will know what you did. Whatever you say to us, that will not change." She said, "If you want to talk, you will come to us. You will come to Earth. You will come unarmed. You will come with one ship." She said, "And you should know, before you make any decision, that we will never be what you thought we were when you came here. We will never be the species you expected to break. Whatever happens next, whether we fight or whether we talk, we will never be that." She sent it. Then she sat back in her chair and waited. The Veth ship arrived at Earth 42 days later. One ship. Unarmed. The stipulation had been met. Vrael himself was on it. He had requested to lead the delegation personally, which his colleagues had agreed to, with the specific understanding that he was responsible for whatever came of it. He had never been to a planet before. Veth ships were vast cities in themselves, and Veth civilization had been spacefaring for so long that planetfall was a historical artifact for most of them. But he descended to the surface of Earth in a shuttle, and he walked out onto the ground, in the thin morning air, in a field outside New Cairo, where the meeting had been arranged, and he looked at the world around him. It was green, very green. The sky was blue in a particular way that no habitat or ship environment could replicate. The air moved. He stood there for a moment, and then the human delegation came to meet him. Secretary General Osei walked at the front. She was not tall. She was not physically imposing in any way he could identify. She wore simple clothes. She came without ceremony. A few advisors. Tanaka walking slightly behind, a translator. They stopped 2 meters apart. Osei looked at Vrael. She said, in a quiet voice that her translator rendered into Veth, "You killed 40 million of my people." Vrael said nothing. You killed them because you thought it would make us stop. You thought it would make us small enough to control." She paused. "I want you to understand what it actually did. I want that to be the first thing we talk about, before anything else, before any question of terms or conditions, or the future. I want you to understand what you made us." Vrail looked at her. He said, "I do not believe I understand it fully." "No," she said. "You don't." She was quiet for a moment. "That's why you're here." They walked to a table that had been set up in the field. They sat down across from each other. The morning light came through clouds and lit the green grass, and the table, and the two figures at it. The talks that followed lasted 3 weeks. They were difficult. They were sometimes close to breaking down entirely. There were things the Veth could not understand about humanity, and things humanity could not accept about the Veth, and those gaps did not close easily. Some of them did not close at all. But they talked, and in the end, they reached an understanding. Not a warm one, not a friendship. Something harder and more durable than that. An agreement between two species, one of which had tried to destroy the other, and failed, and was now trying to understand what had gone wrong with its model of the universe. The terms included the Veth withdrawal from all human space, reparations. The Veth had resources and technology that would accelerate human recovery from the colony attacks, non-aggression across a defined boundary that humanity helped define, from a position of equal standing, and an acknowledgement, placed into the official record of the Veth Council, that humanity had not surrendered and would not have surrendered. That last point had been Osei's. She had insisted on it. Her advisors had told her it was unnecessary, a point of pride, not substance. She had told them it was not for pride. It was for the 40 million. So that the record would show, forever and permanently, that they had not been killed by a species that defeated humanity. They had been killed by a species that tried and failed. Their deaths had not been the end. They had been the beginning of something that the Veth had not expected and could not contain. The record would show that. She had made sure. Sarah Vance was in the river valley when the news came through. She was standing knee-deep in the water, checking the flow rate at the first restored section of the main irrigation system, when her comm chimed with the alert. She read it standing there in the water with mud on her boots and her hands still wet. The war was over. She stood in the river for a long time. Then she climbed out and sat on the bank and looked at the valley. The green was coming back. It was thin and uncertain still. The soil needed years of work, but it was there. The river ran clear for the first time since the bombardment. 2 weeks ago, they had released native fish into the upper section. Yesterday, someone had seen them in the lower section, which meant they were moving, which meant the ecosystem was connecting itself back together. Her 8 companions from New Lisbon were spread across the colony now, each one leading a reclamation team in a different sector. She had messages from all of them in the last week. Updates, requests, problems, occasional small victories. The old man from Callaway Station, who had become one of their best soil specialists, had found a seed cache in an underground storage room that had survived the bombardment. Seeds of native plants that would have taken years to cultivate from scratch. He had sent her the message at 2 in the morning, barely containing himself, writing in all capital letters. She had laughed. She had not laughed in a long time, and it had felt strange and right at the same time. She looked at the valley, and the thin green coming back, and the clear river, and the sky. The ordinary sky of Arden's Rest, the one she had grown up under, the one she had thought she would never see again. The Veth had come here thinking they were ending something. They had been wrong about almost everything. But they had been wrong about this most of all. They had looked at the people of these worlds, ordinary people, farmers and teachers and students and children, and they had seen softness. They had seen things that would break. They had run their calculations on grief and loss and will and resource, and the calculations had told them exactly what they wanted to hear. They had not understood that the farmers knew their soil because they loved it, that the teachers knew their students because those students were the future they were building, that the students were studying because they were curious about a universe that did not stop being interesting no matter how hard it tried to kill you, that the children playing by the river were playing the way children have always played, with the complete and serious dedication of people who are practicing for a life they intend to live fully. They had not understood that softness and strength were not opposites in humans, that the same person who wept at a funeral could build a warship, that the same hands that planted seeds could fire a weapon, that the love people had for their world was not a vulnerability, but a root. The deeper it went, the harder it was to pull out. 40 million people. She would carry that number always. They all would. It would be in the history books forever. It would be in the way the colonies were rebuilt, a little more carefully, a little more thoughtfully, with a little more of the understanding that comes from having lost something precious and gotten the chance to build it back. The Veth had tried to exterminate humanity. Humanity had said no. And then humanity had come home. She stood up. She had work to do. The irrigation system needed 3 more checkpoints before the end of the day, and the soil team in Sector 7 had a question she hadn't answered yet, and someone had found what looked like a surviving structure in the East District that might be worth trying to restore. The day was long and full, and it was going to take years to finish what they had started here. She put her comm away and walked back up the bank and into the valley. The grass was green and thin and new, and it grew under her feet as she walked, finding its way up through the ash and the old burned soil, reaching for the light in the way that living things do, the way that cannot be stopped, the way that does not surrender.